You are told that history belongs to kings, to conquerors, to markets and machines. But this is the first lie of class society. History does not begin in palaces or boardrooms. It begins in the calloused hands that build them, in the exhausted bodies that keep them standing, in the invisible labor that is praised only when it is silent. From the moment you sell your labor to survive, you are written into history, even when power works relentlessly to erase your name. Every road you walk, every factory that hums, every system that claims to be eternal is soaked in accumulated labor. Yet capitalism performs its greatest trick here. It steals not only your time and strength, but also your memory. It teaches you to believe that what you create does not belong to you, that the wealth you generate appears as if by magic, that the system ruling you is natural, inevitable, and beyond challenge. This illusion is not accidental. It is the foundation of domination. Under capitalism, labor becomes a commodity, and the worker becomes an appendage of production. You do not work to fulfill human need. You work to expand capital. The more value you create, the poorer you become, not in absolute terms alone, but in control over your own life. Your labor is frozen into objects you do not own, into profits you will never see, into power that is turned against you. This is exploitation not as moral outrage, but as economic fact. And yet, within this system that seeks to erase you, your labor remembers. It remembers every unpaid hour disguised as efficiency. It remembers every invention stolen and patented by those who never touched the work. It remembers every crisis caused not by workers' excess, but by capital's hunger for endless accumulation. Capitalism depends on your forgetting, because memory leads to consciousness, and consciousness leads to resistance. The ruling class speaks of freedom while binding the worker to necessity. They speak of equality while dividing humanity into owners and owned, decision-makers and the disposable. They speak of progress while reproducing poverty, alienation, and war. Their freedom is the freedom of capital to move without conscience. Their equality is the equal right of the powerful to dominate. Their progress is measured in profit, not human flourishing. This is not a failure of the system, it is its logic. The worker is isolated, fragmented, forced to compete with their own class for survival. Division is cultivated as policy, nationality, race, religion, gender. Every difference is sharpened into a weapon to prevent unity, for a divided working class is a manageable working class. As long as workers fight each other, they do not fight the system that exploits them all. But history does not move forward on lies forever. The same labor that capital exploits also produces its own gravedigger. Every factory, every office, every digital platform concentrates workers into shared conditions, shared suffering, shared potential. From this shared reality emerges class consciousness, the understanding that personal hardship is not personal failure, but structural design. When the worker recognizes themselves not as an isolated individual, but as part of a collective force, the balance of power begins to tremble. You are told you are replaceable. This is another lie. Capital cannot exist without labor. Machines do not create value, they transfer it. Markets do not produce wealth, people do. The worker is not a cost to be minimized, but the source of all social wealth. To deny this is to deny reality itself. And when workers remember this, when they reclaim the memory embedded in their labor, they reclaim history. Revolution is not chaos, it is clarity. It is the moment when the oppressed recognize that the conditions imposed upon them are neither natural nor eternal. It is the transformation of society from one organized around profit to one organized around human need. It is not the substitution of one ruler for another, but the abolition of class rule itself. This transformation will not be gifted from above. No ruling class has ever voted away its own power. Rights are not granted, they are one. Justice does not emerge from appeals to morality alone, but from organized struggle grounded in material reality. The worker must move from endurance to action, from awareness to organization, from scattered resistance to collective force. Do not ask whether you are ready. Capitalism ensures you are never ready. Only desperate, only tired, only compliant. Ask instead whether the system deserves to continue. Your labor has already built the world. It has fed cities, powered empires, and generated unimaginable wealth. Imagine what it could do if liberated from exploitation, if directed toward collective well-being rather than private accumulation. Imagine a society where production serves life, not profit, where work is a means of self-development, not survival, where history remembers not the few who owned everything, but the many who made everything possible. The ruling class fears nothing more than a working class that remembers. Remember that your poverty is produced. Remember that your isolation is manufactured. Remember that your labor is powerful, collective, and historical. History is not finished. It is unfinished because you are still working, still producing, still enduring. And as long as labor lives, so does the possibility of transformation. Workers of the world do not need permission to reclaim what they have always created. They need only to recognize themselves in one another and act accordingly. Labor is the true creator of all wealth and history, yet it is systematically denied recognition within societies built upon exploitation. Every material object, every institution, every technological advance begins not with capital, not with ownership, but with human labor applied to nature. Capital presents itself as the source of productivity, as if money itself could generate value. But capital is nothing more than accumulated labor, appropriated from workers in the past and reinvested to command workers in the present. Without labor, capital is inert, lifeless, incapable of movement or growth. This fundamental truth is obscured because acknowledging it would expose the illegitimacy of a system that allows a small minority to claim ownership over what the majority produces. History is often written as the story of rulers, empires, and great individuals, yet beneath every conquest and every crown lies the labor of the masses. Cities are not built by kings, but by workers who quarry stone, shape steel, and raise structures with their bodies and time. Armies march not because of generals alone, but because laborers produce food, weapons, roads, and supplies. Even the cultural achievements celebrated as the pinnacle of civilization, art, science, philosophy, are only possible because labor sustains society and creates the conditions in which thought and creativity can emerge. To erase labor from history is to erase the material foundation upon which history itself unfolds. Under capitalism, this erasure becomes systematic. The worker produces value, but that value appears as the property of the capitalist. The product of labor confronts the worker as something alien, something owned by another, something that can even be used against them. This alienation is not merely psychological, it is embedded in the economic structure. The worker sells labor power for a wage that represents only a fraction of the value created, while surplus value is extracted and accumulated by those who own the means of production. Wealth thus grows not from clever management or risk-taking myths, but from unpaid labor concealed behind contracts and market abstractions. The same process that generates wealth also generates historical motion. Class struggle not an accident or a deviation from progress. It is the engine of historical change. Every mode of production contains contradictions between those who labor and those who appropriate the fruits of labor. Slavery, feudalism, and capitalism all relied on different forms of exploitation, yet each produced resistance, revolt, and transformation. The oppressed classes were never passive recipients of history, they were its active force, even when denied literacy, power, or voice. Revolutions did not erupt because ideas appeared spontaneously, but because material conditions created by labor became intolerable. Capitalism claims to reward productivity while rendering labor invisible. Machines are celebrated, markets are praised, entrepreneurs are idolized, yet the worker is reduced to a cost of production. Technology does not eliminate labor, it reorganizes it, intensifies it, and often deepens exploitation by increasing productivity without increasing workers' control over what they produce. The more efficient labor becomes, the more surplus is extracted, widening inequality and concentrating power. This contradiction reveals that wealth accumulation under capitalism is not aligned with human need, but with profit maximization. Labor also carries memory, even when official history attempts to erase it. The knowledge of production, the skills passed from one generation of workers to another, the traditions of resistance and solidarity all persist beneath the surface of dominant narratives. Every strike, every union formed, every demand for dignity is an assertion that labor is not merely an economic input, but a historical subject. When workers organize, they do more than negotiate wages. They challenge the very structure that denies their central role in creating society. To recognize labor as the source of all wealth and history is to expose the fiction of neutrality within capitalism. Markets are not impartial, and property relations are not natural. They are enforced arrangements designed to ensure that those who do not work can continue to live from the labor of others. This recognition undermines the moral authority of exploitation and reveals the possibility of a different social order, one in which production is organized collectively and democratically. The liberation of labor is therefore inseparable from the liberation of humanity itself. A society that continues to deny labor its historical role condemns itself to recurring crises, inequality, and alienation. When labor becomes conscious of its own power and historical significance, it ceases to be merely a means of survival and becomes a force capable of reshaping the conditions of life, production, and social relations, opening the path toward a world in which history is no longer written against those who create it. Capitalism erases workers' memory to maintain domination, because memory is dangerous to power. To remember is to recognize patterns, to connect present suffering with past exploitation, to see that what is experienced as personal failure is in fact a collective condition produced by a system designed for accumulation rather than human dignity. Capital cannot tolerate this recognition, because once workers remember their shared history, they begin to understand their shared position, and domination depends on isolation and forgetfulness. This erasure begins with how labor is represented. Workers are taught to see their jobs as temporary transactions rather than as part of a long historical process of exploitation. Each generation is encouraged to believe that its hardships are new, unique, and unconnected to those who came before. The struggles of earlier workers, strikes, uprisings, unions, and revolutions are either minimized, distorted, or framed as unnecessary disruptions to progress. In this way, capitalism presents itself as the natural endpoint of history, rather than as one stage among many shaped by conflict and resistance. The organization of work itself reinforces this forgetting. Labor is fragmented into specialized tasks, divided across industries, outsourced across borders, and mediated through digital systems that obscure human relationships. Workers rarely see the full product of their labor, nor the collective process that brings it into existence. This fragmentation prevents workers from recognizing their interdependence and their shared power. When labor is reduced to isolated functions, memory of collective creation fades, and with it fades the understanding that society is built and sustained by workers, not owners. Education under capitalism plays a central role in this process. Schools train individuals to compete rather than to cooperate, to adapt to the market rather than to question it. Economic relations are presented as neutral laws rather than historical arrangements shaped by class struggle. The worker learns skills but not history, obedience but not analysis. By stripping education of its critical dimension, capitalism ensures that workers enter the labour market equipped to function, but not to. Remember how similar systems were challenged and transformed in the past. Media and culture further deepen this amnesia. Success stories focus on individual achievement, reinforcing the myth that wealth is the result of talent and effort rather than exploitation. Poverty is portrayed as misfortune or moral failure, never as a predictable outcome of surplus extraction and unequal ownership. Collective action is depicted as chaotic or outdated, while submission to market logic is framed as realism. In this environment, workers are encouraged to identify with aspirational images of wealth rather than with their own class, weakening memory of shared struggle. Crises reveal how deliberate this erasure is. When capitalism enters periods of collapse, workers are told that sacrifice is necessary, that austerity is unavoidable, that there is no alternative. The memory of previous crises, how they were caused by speculation, overproduction, and profit-driven instability, is suppressed. Instead, blame is shifted onto workers themselves, onto migrants, or onto abstract forces presented as beyond human control. Forgetting becomes a survival mechanism imposed from above, preventing workers from drawing lessons that could lead to resistance. Yet memory persists despite these efforts. It survives in lived experience, in the recognition that longer hours do not bring security, that productivity increases do not bring freedom, that promises of upward mobility rarely materialize. It survives in informal conversations, in inherited stories of struggle, in moments when workers recognize themselves in one another. This latent memory is precisely what capitalism seeks to keep dormant because, once activated, it disrupts the narrative of inevitability. To remember is to see that rights were not granted voluntarily, but won through conflict. The working day was shortened, wages were raised, and protections were established only because workers organized and resisted. Forgetting this history allows capital to reclaim what was conceded under pressure. Memory, therefore, is not merely recollection, it is a form of power. It exposes domination as historical rather than natural, and exploitation as systemic rather than accidental. When workers recover their memory, they begin to understand themselves as historical subjects rather than passive objects of economic forces. They recognize that their labor has shaped the world repeatedly, even when denied acknowledgement. This recognition transforms frustration into analysis and endurance into potential action. Capitalism depends on erasing this memory because domination requires workers who see only the present moment, disconnected from the past and incapable of imagining a different future, while memory reconnects labor to its own history, revealing continuity between past exploitation and present conditions, and opening the possibility that what has been made by labor can also be unmade and reorganized by it. Exploitation is structural, not accidental or the result of individual moral failure, because it is built into the very foundation of the capitalist mode of production. It does not arise from the greed or cruelty of particular employers, nor from the ignorance or weakness of workers, but from a system organized around private ownership of the means of production and the compulsion to extract surplus value. Capitalism can function only if those who own capital are able to appropriate the unpaid labor of those who possess nothing but their capacity to work. This relationship is not an exception to the system, it is its central mechanism. The worker enters the labor market formally free, yet materially constrained. Freedom under capitalism means the freedom to sell one's labor power or to face deprivation. The wage contract appears as an equal exchange, but this equality is illusory. The worker is paid not for the full value created, but only for the cost of reproducing labor power, while the surplus produced beyond that cost is claimed by the capitalist as profit. This extraction does not require deception or abuse. It occurs even when contracts are honored and laws are followed. Exploitation persists precisely because it is legal, normalized, and embedded in everyday economic life. Moral explanations obscure this reality. When exploitation is framed as the result of bad actors, unethical corporations, or insufficient compassion, the system itself is left intact. Capitalism encourages this framing because it allows domination to appear as a series of unfortunate mistakes rather than as a coherent structure. Replacing one employer with another does not alter the fundamental relationship between labor and capital. Even the most well-intentioned capitalist must compete, cut costs, and maximize profit in order to survive within the market. Structural pressure overrides individual morality, ensuring that exploitation reproduces itself regardless of personal values. This structure also shapes how workers perceive themselves. When wages are low and conditions harsh, workers are encouraged to internalize blame. They are told they lack skills, ambition, or adaptability. Success is portrayed as a personal achievement, while failure is individualized and moralized. This narrative conceals the reality that exploitation is experienced unevenly but produced uniformly by the system. Some workers suffer more than others, but all workers are subjected to surplus extraction. Individual advancement does not abolish exploitation, it merely redistributes its burdens. The structural nature of exploitation becomes clearer during periods of economic growth as well as crisis. Even when productivity rises and profits increase, workers do not gain proportional control over their labor or its products. Technological advances, instead of reducing work or expanding freedom, are often used to intensify labor, extend working hours, or eliminate jobs altogether. These outcomes are not the result of malicious intent alone, but of a system that prioritizes profit over human need. Efficiency under capitalism serves accumulation, not emancipation. Law and ideology reinforce this structure. Property rights are treated as sacred, while labor rights are conditional and contested. The ownership of productive resources by a minority is presented as natural, while collective ownership is portrayed as unrealistic or dangerous. This ideological framework ensures that exploitation is perceived as unfortunate but unavoidable, discouraging challenges to the system itself. Workers are permitted to demand better conditions within limits, but not to question why their labor must be owned by others at all. Historical analysis reveals that exploitation has taken different forms across different modes of production, yet remains structural wherever class divisions exist. Slavery relied on direct coercion, feudalism on obligation and tradition, capitalism on wage labor and market dependency. Each system justified exploitation differently, but none relied primarily on moral failure to sustain itself. Capitalism's innovation lies in disguising exploitation as freedom, making domination appear voluntary while remaining economically compulsory. Understanding exploitation as structural shifts the focus from reforming behavior to transforming relationships. It reveals that charity cannot replace justice, and that ethical consumption cannot dismantle systemic inequality. As long as labor is compelled to sell itself to survive, exploitation will persist regardless of regulatory adjustments or corporate pledges. The problem is not that capitalists behave badly, but that the system requires them to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. When workers recognize exploitation as structural, they begin to see their shared condition rather than isolated grievances. This recognition undermines narratives that divide workers against one another and redirects attention toward the underlying relations of production. Structural exploitation cannot be voted away or shamed into disappearance. it must be confronted through collective organization and material struggle. Only by challenging the system that normalizes surplus extraction can labor move from a position of enforced dependence toward one of collective control over production, distribution, and social life. Class consciousness transforms isolation into collective power by revealing that what appears as individual struggle is in fact a shared social condition produced by a common system of exploitation. Under capitalism, workers experience their lives as fragmented and private, each person confronting wages, debt, insecurity, and exhaustion, as if these were personal problems to be solved alone. This isolation is not accidental, it is necessary for domination. A worker who sees only their own hardship lacks the framework to identify its causes, and without understanding the structure that produces suffering, resistance remains scattered, defensive, and easily contained. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize themselves not as isolated individuals competing in a neutral market, but as members of a class defined by their relationship to production. This recognition breaks the illusion that success and failure are purely personal outcomes. It exposes how millions of workers across different industries, regions, and cultures are subjected to the same mechanisms of surplus extraction, wage suppression, and precarity. Once this shared position becomes visible, isolation loses its ideological grip, and what was previously endured in silence begins to be understood collectively. Capitalism works tirelessly to prevent this transformation. Workers are separated by contracts, hierarchies, and identities that obscure their common interests. Competition is encouraged as a virtue, forcing workers to view one another as threats rather than allies. Precarious employment keeps people in constant fear, making solidarity appear risky and unrealistic. These conditions cultivate a sense of powerlessness, reinforcing the belief that resistance is futile and that adaptation is the only option. Class consciousness directly challenges this belief by showing that power does not reside in individuals, but in collective labor. When workers become conscious of themselves as a class, they begin to see that their labor is not merely a means of survival, but the foundation of society itself. Every institution, every commodity, every system depends on their continued participation. This realization transforms the meaning of work. Labor is no longer experienced only as exploitation, but also as latent power. The ability to produce becomes inseparable from the ability to withhold, disrupt, and reorganize production. What once appeared as weakness reveals itself as potential strength. This transformation does not occur spontaneously. Class consciousness develops through shared experience, struggle, and organization. Strikes, unions, and collective actions are not only tools for immediate demands, they are schools of consciousness. Through struggle, workers learn that their conditions improve not through obedience or individual effort, but through unity. Each collective victory undermines the myth of inevitability and reinforces the understanding that power concedes nothing without pressure. Even defeats contribute to consciousness by clarifying the forces aligned against labor. As class consciousness deepens, it reshapes identity itself. Workers no longer define themselves primarily by occupation, nationality, or status within the labor market, but by their common position within a system of exploitation. This does not erase differences, but places them within a broader framework of solidarity. Division loses its effectiveness when workers understand that while their NCEs may vary, the source of their exploitation is shared. This understanding weakens the ideological tools used to pit workers against one another and strengthens the capacity for coordinated action. Collective power emerges not simply from numbers, but from coordination grounded in consciousness. An unorganized mass can be controlled, a conscious class cannot. When workers act together with a shared understanding of their interests, they challenge not only individual employers, but the structure of domination itself. Demands expand beyond wages and hours toward questions of control, ownership, and purpose. The struggle shifts from improving conditions within the system to questioning why the system exists in its current form at all. Class consciousness also alters the relationship between the present and history. Workers begin to see themselves as part of an ongoing historical process, rather than as isolated participants in a static economy. Past struggles become sources of insight rather than distant events, and future possibilities become imaginable rather than abstract. This historical awareness reinforces collective identity, reminding workers that the conditions they face were created by human action and can therefore be transformed by human action. Isolation thrives on the belief that nothing can change. Class consciousness dismantles this belief by connecting individual experience to collective capacity. It replaces resignation with analysis, fear with solidarity, and endurance with organization. In doing so, it transforms the working class from a population managed by capital into a social force capable of challenging exploitation at its roots, asserting role over production, and reshaping society according to collective needs rather than private profit. Organized workers are the force capable of revolutionary change because power in society is rooted not in ideas alone, but in material relations of production. Capital governs not through persuasion, but through control over labor, resources, and time. As long as workers remain fragmented, this control appears absolute. Each worker negotiates alone, fears alone, and bears the consequences alone. Organization transforms this condition by converting dispersed labor into a coordinated social force capable of confronting the structures that dominate it. Capitalism depends on workers' disorganization to function smoothly. Individual workers can be replaced, disciplined, or ignored, but organized workers cannot be so easily dismissed. When labor acts collectively, it disrupts the illusion that capital is self-sustaining. Production halts, circulation slows, profits vanish, and the hidden dependency of capital on labor becomes visible. This is why organization is met with resistance at every level, through legal barriers, repression, ideological attacks, and attempts to co-opt or weaken collective movements. The fear of organized labor is not ideological, it is material. Organization is not merely a tactical choice, but a historical necessity. The working class does not possess wealth, land, or institutions of power by default. What it possesses is its labor and the capacity to act together. Without organization, this capacity remains latent, unused, and easily exploited. With organization, labor becomes conscious of itself as a class and capable of acting not only but offensively, challenging ownership, authority, and control over production itself. Revolutionary change does not emerge from spontaneous outrage alone. Anger without organization exhausts itself, while organization channels experience into sustained struggle. Through unions, councils, assemblies, and collective movements, workers develop the ability to coordinate across workplaces, industries, and regions. This coordination transforms isolated conflicts into systemic challenges. Demands evolve from immediate survival toward structural transformation, reflecting a growing understanding that exploitation cannot be permanently alleviated within the existing order. Organized workers also develop discipline and strategy, qualities essential for confronting entrenched power. Capital is organized globally, backed by states, laws, and force. To oppose this, labor must move beyond reactive resistance and build durable structures capable of sustaining struggle over time. Organization creates continuity, allowing lessons to be preserved, leadership to be accountable, and collective memory to be maintained. Without this continuity, each generation is forced to relearn what the previous one already discovered through struggle. The revolutionary potential of organized labor lies in its position within production. Workers are not external critics of the system, they operate at its core. They understand its functioning because they make it function. This proximity gives organized workers insight into how production can be reorganized, redirected, and democratized. Revolutionary change is not the destruction of society, but its reconstitution on new foundations. Those who produce are uniquely positioned to decide how production should serve human needs rather than private accumulation. Organization also reshapes consciousness. Through collective struggle, workers learn that power is not granted but taken, not negotiated from weakness but asserted through unity. This learning process undermines deference to authority and exposes the state as an instrument that ultimately protects property and capital. Organized workers come to see that neutrality is a myth and that institutions claiming to represent everyone consistently align against labor when fundamental interests are challenged. The ruling class understands this dynamic clearly, which is why it seeks to fragment labor through subcontracting, precarious employment, and global supply chains designed to weaken solidarity. These strategies are not signs of confidence, but of vulnerability. They reveal that capital recognizes the threat posed by organized workers and adapts to contain it. Organization responds by finding new forms of solidarity that transcend borders, sectors, and identities, reconnecting workers through shared interests rather than imposed divisions. Revolutionary change requires more than moral outrage or intellectual critique. It requires a force capable of reshaping material reality. Organized workers represent this force because they unite the capacity to produce with the will to transform. When labor is organized, it ceases to be merely a resource extracted by capital and becomes an active subject of history. The question of social transformation then shifts from whether change is possible to how power will be exercised once workers act collectively, how production will be reorganized, how resources will be distributed, and how social life will be structured once those who create wealth assert control over what they have always made possible. The truth that runs through all of this cannot be silenced any longer. Labor is a source of wealth, memory, and history, and yet it has been systematically stripped of power, voice, and recognition. Capitalism survives by fragmenting workers, erasing their past, disguising exploitation as fairness, and convincing the oppressed that their suffering is natural or deserved. But these illusions fracture when workers recognize themselves as a class, when memory returns, when isolation gives way to solidarity, and when organization transforms endurance into force. History moves not because power is generous, but because the exploited refuse to remain invisible. The structures that dominate society were built by labor and are sustained by labor, and therefore they can be challenged, dismantled, and reshaped by labor. When workers reclaim their collective memory, recognize exploitation as structural, develop class consciousness, and organize across divisions, they cease to be managed objects of history and become its authors. The future is not decided by Ital's claims of inevitability, but by whether those who create the world choose to take responsibility for transforming it, asserting control over production, over social life, and over history itself.